Welcome back to Garbeardia. Today I have for you the next chapter of the Veil Riders. I hope you enjoy, so let's get started. The overall mood of the camp changed, as if someone was watching hentai without the earbuds in at a funeral. All eyes were on the blue helmets that strode out from the mouth of the cave, all of them walking in a triangle-like formation with the leader at the point. There was a kind of arrogance in their footfalls as they walked out into the main parade of the camp, and they looked around as if trying to find somebody, despite Yule standing in the open in front of them, flanked by almost 10 Veil Riders. The one that appeared to be in charge spoke aloud in Belgian-accented English, casting his eyes around at all the Veil Riders who stood watching, deathly silent with their weapons in their hands. "Which one of you is Yule?" Yule's hairs all stood on end as he took in the situation. There was no fucking way that the US would allow UN forces on its home soil. What the hell was going down on the other side of the veil? He took the scuttlebutt of invasion just as it was. Scuttlebutt. But now there was a goddamn blue helmet looking at him right in the face. He idled forward, his boots crunching on the loose rock, and he rested his hand on his M9 in a false, relaxed manner, as if that was where his hand had always found itself. "I'm Yule, co-commander of the Veil Riders. State your business." All the Veil Riders looked over at Yule, as he rarely ever spoke to his rank, and it was even rarer when he called himself co-commander. The command, however, was registered in the tone of his voice, and very quietly a lot of rifle safeties clicked and snapped to their firing positions. "Ah, Mr. Yule, I have been sent here by your President Trump in his commandments to relieve you of your duty. We have all come to an agreement. Your services are no longer needed. We are all going to share this world for the betterment of all. We will need you to all surrender your weapons, of course, and proceed through the veil, back home to America. Everyone is waiting for you." The man smiled smugly the entire time as he said this, as if relishing the elevation he had above these rustics in command. "Oh, is that right?" Yule slid his left foot out ever so slightly, taking a modified isosceles stance, and cocked his right foot just enough so his balance was right. He could hear the hands of the Veil Riders beside him tightening on their weapons, the strain of their slings on their shoulders, the subtle tick of fingers laying across triggers. "I was not under the impression we were working with the UN." Yule's own grip tightened further, with the ever so soft sound of flesh gripping metal, and the Veil Riders beside him became rigid, unblinking, winding up for the spring. On the hill above the cave entrance, in the heavy weapons positions, he saw Veil Riders lift up their weapons as silently as they could, and the barrels of multiple cruisers began to slowly traverse onto the bundle of blue helmets below, the sun glinting and gleaming on the barrel brakes as they swung. Like I have said, we came to an agreement. I have it all down on these documents here." The man held out a bundle of papers. "Please set down your weapons. We are friends now. There is nothing to worry about." Yule stepped forward to reach for the papers, holding out his left hand to take them. As soon as his hand gripped them, many things happened at once. First, something caught his eye from inside the cave to the veil. Movement, and the dancing of a few shadows within the darkness, illuminated by the light that struggled to pierce the gloom. This sent the very nervous ambush squirrel inside his brain chittering and running around like mad. But what came next was something he could not miss. The wind seemed to blow hard for just a moment, and the long fronts of these blue helmets' coats were blown open just enough to see within. Inside the coat he saw that the UN soldiers wore fatigues, full battle rattle, and had drum-fed shotguns hanging at their sides. Yule locked eyes with the commander of these troops and stopped dead in his tracks, left hand gripping the papers. There was barely any space between them, just the stack of papers that each commander gripped. The blue helmet commander's eyes twitched down at Yule's hand, white-knuckling his M9, and Yule's eyes flicked to the other man's hand cocking to reach into his own coat. When the wind died down as suddenly as it came, there was a breath's pause before Yule jerked his arm right as the blue helmets swung their coats open. There was a whirl of fabric and the crisp click of the M9 leaving its holster. Time churned to a crawl as blue helmets and Veil Riders roared to life and brought their weapons up to bear. In a smooth motion, Yule drew his M9 level with the blue helmet commander's face, while never letting go of the papers with his left. The pistol's sight right on the nose of the man, and belched out a singular 9mm ball round. The full metal jacket round splacked wetly as it blew spatters of brain matter and bone onto the man standing behind the commander, blood and tissue littering his eyes and blinding them. The bullet kept on going, being thrown off course by the amount of bone and jerked in the air, colliding with the collarbone of the blinded blue helmet. The sudden death caught the blue helmets off guard, but not the Veil Riders, who were all waiting for the first move. A sudden burst of automatic and rifle fire tore into the blue helmets, ripping their coats apart in a flurry of crimson and broken flesh, scattering their blood across the main parade of the camp. Rounds snapped and cracked by Yule's face as the Veil Riders behind him saw the cave as well and began pumping fire into the opening. Return fire was immediate, but brief, taking down just 3 Veil Riders during the exchange. Yule, Coco, and a small group of Veil Riders rushed the cave, firing at anything that moved and executing anything that was still breathing. Laying wait inside was a group of almost 30 blue helmets, presumably to ambush the Veil Riders when they were disarmed, or attack anyone who didn't surrender their weapons. Yule strode forward into the hazy darkness of the cave, blood spattered all over the walls, and filling the interior with the coppery tang of death. He stepped over the cooling bodies of the blue helmets, gunshots ringing out behind him as Veil Riders found a few playing possum, until he came to the front of the Veil. The darkness pooled and ebbed in front of him. He had a mind to blow it, destroy it so no one could come through. But that would also mean none of the Veil Riders could ever go back home. If his assumptions were right, things were not as they left, and it was possible that they were being invaded, strong-armed. He stood before the glooming portal for some time, his hand still holding his M9 as he stared into the pitch black of the Veil. Pack it up, all of it. We're moving out. Get those ATVs loaded as much as they can haul and carry. After the fallen Veil Riders were buried to the side of the camp and their ID cards taken by Yule, he and Coco came to a quick decision. They were going to split their forces, and in a mutual joke between them, called it Order 66. 66 Veil Riders for Yule, 66 Veil Riders for Coco. They would do an even split on the crew serves, with Yule taking Betty and Coco taking his 81mm mortars, with a complement of 240 Bravos and M249s between them. Same went for ammo, fuel, food, and vehicles. In a matter of an hour, the entire camp was torn down, and 2 companies of Veil Riders moved out. Coco's Zerg company was going northwest. Yule's Coswling company was heading northeast. Gremlin was going with Yule as well, but had taught someone else her guru ways with technology and sent them with a Zerg company, so that the 2 companies had at least some way to keep in touch. The 2 companies left with speed, running and roaring into the night, while Camp Kickass was left behind. The bodies of the blue helmets left where they had fallen. Cosbling Company began their march in standard infantry columns while the motorized vehicles trundled down the middle, hauling some trailers filled with supplies. Dirt bikes raced ahead and scouted, then waited for the columns before racing off again. This was the same road that took them to the elven village, and they came across it again after some time of traveling. The column took the direct path through the town, dirt bikes being as quiet as they could while rolling through, and the townsfolk came out to see what the noise was despite the time of night. The governor, still wearing his night clothes, came out of his home and waved Yule over. While he spoke to Yule in his language, Yule could tell he was asking what was wrong. Yule pulled out his notepad and drew a UN helmet, then drew an X through it, and pointed the way to Fort Kickass. He drew a skull next to the helmet as well, with a rough drawing that implied the elves should stab the blue helmets with their spears. After which, he gave the governor one of the fallen Vale Rider's patches, still speckled with blood, and patted him on the shoulder before moving on with his troops. They burned out of the city as fast as they could without being too rude, and Yule used the pictures he took of the elves' maps to direct their path, following the main roadway to the next village. If he remembered right, these should be elves as well, according to what the governor drew. He had to admit, having some kind of cell signal here would be nice, but all they had were short-distance radios, and it wouldn't be long before they were unable to be in contact with Zerg Company. Cosmoline Company humped along the road all the way through the night and well into the morning, before finally stopping to rest and letting everyone take a breather. Chix was groaning about not being able to ride on the ATVs, having to lug her heavy rifle by herself for miles, while Domino happily chewed on a first strike bar and just admired the scenery. The company broke down into watches and pickets, while the main body rested and checked on their vehicles. Yule pored over the maps on his phone and the maps Gremlin had given him all that time before, and quickly came to the conclusion that the other village was almost a 6-day walk. He sighed, thumping his head against his phone as he thought. They needed something to barter with in order to get food and water, maybe some horses. But they needed almost every damn thing on the trailers and ATVs. He supposed that when the blue helmets finally take over the camp and start trying to push their influence, they could start taking what they needed from whom they killed, but who knew how long that would be? Yule looked up at his troopers, sprawled out in the grass napping or curled up on their rucksacks like heavily armed cats. He hoped the city ahead had some kind of magic users in it, or a college of some sorts, just for the vain hope that someone could read his mind and know what he wanted. He let Cosmoline Company rest for several hours before calling them back onto their feet to continue marching. They continued this pattern for 2 more days, halting inside a heavily forested area that the road cut through due to slamming rains that came down in fat drops from the clouds above. With the trees, they were able to cast up tarps and tie them to the trunks and limbs for cover, and everyone hunkered down together to wait out the storm. Yule looked out into the misty trees and sulked. This was the perfect coffee weather, but without that constant supply line coming in, he was having to ration his dehydrated coffee as much as he was able, but the urge to down a steaming retort came at every waking moment of the day. As he stared out into the trees and slowly wound a piece of grass around his finger, he heard Gremlin nearby arguing with another rider. It doesn't make sense. If the planet is larger than Earth, we should be squished, like trees and plants falling down and crushed. Maybe the core is made out of fairy dust, Gremlin. Fairy dust? Fairy dust doesn't make tectonic plates move. The two continued to bicker at each other over the patter of the rain, and Yule grinned to himself. No point in getting mad over this fantasy realm. Best come to terms with what they have. Yule heard a rustle in the bushes a few feet from him, and rested his hand on his M9 while sighing. He waited, and after a few minutes, a fox poked its head out from a nearby bush, its eyes looking at Yule curiously. "Hey, buddy." The fox jerked its head back inside the bush, and Yule heard it run deeper into the woods. He laughed airily to no one in particular, and leaned back against the ATV he was sitting next to. The rain continued to play a rhythmic beat on the tarps, and Yule stared out into the forest. On the 4th day, they finally came into contact with something on the road. A small train of wagons was heading down the road towards the known elf village, and all the Veil Riders pulled off the road to let them pass. The wagons, however, stopped, and the language barrier made itself painfully apparent once again as the elves tried to identify just who these strange people with short ears were. Yule was able to show them pictures of the maps from the other village, and the elves confirmed the Veil Riders were heading to the bigger city, tapping on the little marker and pointing down the road. Pantomiming became a sudden skill set that Yule had to master, as he tried to figure out just how to convey "how fucking long till I'm there" via hand signals and hand puppeting. Painfully and awkwardly, he finally got his answer of "one day." And they waved the wagons goodbye as they continued on their way. A lot of the Veil Riders were annoyed. These elves only had produce and raw materials, no booze or anything fun to trade, and it left them all in a dark mood as they trundled down the road. As a matter of fact, none of the Veil Riders were in a good mood. Almost 2 weeks of humping gear through the woods, getting rained on, no way to bathe, and water rationing had almost everyone in a sour mood. There was also the looming cloud of fuel running out, as the ATVs and dirt bikes chewed through gasoline far worse than they had thought, and they had perhaps a few days left to power the guzzling machines. The good news is that, well, the fuel getting burned up made a lot of the weight go away. Good news and bad news all in the same knot. Yule slapped his filthy patrol cap on his knee and sighed ruefully. He wanted a bath. He didn't want to admit it, being an adamant shower man, but a good soak in warm water called to him like a seductive siren. He was stirred from his soap bubble daydream by another elven child tugging on his pants, and he playfully slapped at their hand with his hat and blew a raspberry at them. The traffic was thicker here, and the Veil Riders moved completely off the road to give the locals their right of way. Naturally, all traffic stopped when the riders walked by, but they just trudged on towards the city, whose walls and many homes loomed in the distance. It seemed like the main keep and inner city were protected by the walls, while the rest of the homes and other districts lay outside of the city. It all seemed very nice, actually. It must have been just what the Middle Ages looked like in Europe. The eggs would have loved this, Yule thought to himself, and thought back on the eggs. He hoped they were okay, since they never came back from the Vale, and were probably snatched up by whatever was waiting for them on the other side. Keep it tight, guys. Also, don't let those kids on the ATVs. I don't want one accidentally hurting itself on the damn things. The Veil Riders' moods picked up sharply with all these giggling elven children running around, who in turn jumped and played with every single damn part of Yule's convoy and brought it to a screeching halt about 100 yards from the perimeter of the city. Veil Riders gave piggyback rides while in full combat kit, gave away their hoarded snacks, or let them play with their phones and take pictures of themselves while all parties laughed and giggled. Yule should have been mad, but he just couldn't muster it. He just smiled, still annoyed, but still smiling, while sitting on an ATV sideways and leaning forward on his knees. He cast his eyes along his 66 men and women, then onto the district to his right. It was a large city, so large that the living and working districts spilled out of the walls and onto the plains surrounding the city, sprawling out in chaotic lanes and roads like the arteries of a heart. They had arrived the morning of, marching through the night just to finally get here and get it over with. Yule darkly hoped that maybe they would be slaughtered and their time here ended, but it seemed that was not the case. When they arrived, walking along the road in a column, the district they were approaching almost came out in force to greet them. They brought water and food to the ragged Veil Riders, and their hospitality was almost suspiciously generous. Yule was on edge for the first hours of the morning, but didn't have the energy anymore after the women brought out jars of honey, jams, bread, and fruits for them to gnaw on. Yule himself drained half a jar of honey with a load of bread, leaving the rest of the better food to his troopers as well as the watered-down wine. Yule kept staring at the district, the elves walking back and forth in their business and going about their routines. The normality of it all was almost culture-shocking. They were just normal folk with long ears. They had their urges for food, wine, beer, entertainment, work, money, They were just like his Veil Riders in most ways, except the guns. The guns were a bit different. He twisted in his seat and looked behind at the rear of the scattering of Veil Riders. He had told the crew servants to set up a rear firing screen, covering the tree line in case they were being followed. Instead of seeing a group of hardened killers watching their six, he saw a little girl sitting on the receiver of Betty as a female Veil Rider teeter-tottered her up and down. Christ alive. Yule just laughed dryly and plopped his cap on a little boy who kept bugging him. The boy sniffed it and made a horrified face, which made Yule bark out in genuine laughter. It was okay, for now. Let his troopers relax for the moment. Yule took his hat back and plopped it on his own head, while the little elf boy rustled his hair to try and get the smell out of it. There was a sudden burst of chatter from near the district, and all the Veil Riders turned their heads to the noise. Yule hopped off the ATV and brought his K2 around off his back and at the low ready, while all the other Veil Riders tucked children behind them, and a chorus of weapon bolts slammed forward as everyone prepared for whatever it was heading towards them from the nearby district. The elves parted around a pack of figures walking through the crowd, and Yule lowered his rifle, waving at the rest of the Veil Riders to lower theirs as well. He didn't see anything particularly scary, not even weapons, and instead sat back down on the ATV, pulling one of his last few cigars from his side pouch. As he fished out his MRE matches and struck one, his eyes followed the figure in the lead. This one didn't look like a governor, or a mayor, or a king for that matter. It looked like a hobo, to be frank, but everyone parted for her as she walked towards the Veil Riders. "Make a lane," Yule groaned, shaking the match to put it out and taking a drag from his cigar, puffing tiredly as he rubbed at his eyelid with his thumb. Yule finally saw her as she broke out from the crowd, and she smiled at the Veil Riders around her. She was barefoot and wearing a myriad of different colored articles of clothing. It was almost as if she picked out random ends and cut-offs and sewed them together. Tying it all together was a thick leather belt that held an armament of pouches, which held in place a kind of leather skirt that went down to her ankles. Yule then noticed she held a pair of leather sandals in her hand, and surmised that she must be enjoying the feeling of the grass on her feet. She was pretty slight in build, with a fresh and young-looking face, speckled with dark maroon freckles that fell down her cheeks and down onto her clavicles. Yule rolled his eyes as he puffed his cigar. These people appeared to not believe in bras, and seemed almost too proud of their cleavage, if they had any, and this elf was no different. He did his best to keep his eyes on her face, watching the eyes that bore into him from around their laugh lines. The elf woman placed her hands on her waist, and looked at Yule with a big toothy smile, while he tipped up the bill of his hat and said hello with a motion of his cigar. She pulled out an ornate-looking necklace and held it to her forehead, and tapped her foot patiently. The necklace seemed to be filled with some kind of amber and crimson liquid that refused to emulsify together for whatever reason. Yule furrowed his brows and smiled awkwardly. "Going to tell my fortune, Long-Ear?" The elf closed her eyes, then opened them some seconds later, having a triumphant smile. "Only if you give me this coffee I've heard about." Her voice was light and playful, and the known words flowing out of it was a welcome thing to Yule's ears. He closed his eyes and cocked his head ever so slightly, then opened them again, before he thrust up his arms, clenching his cigar in his teeth and shouting to the sky in true joy. "Thank fuck! I am so fucking bad at pantomiming." The elf just giggled and waved at the elves behind her to come forth. This is the end of Chapter 4 of the Veil Riders. Chapter 5 to come next month. I'm glad you guys are enjoying the story, and if you might have noticed, I am paying attention to your comments. So, if you like this story and other stories like them, be sure to like and subscribe to Garbeardia. and leave your thoughts down below in the comments so I can read them. I'm glad you guys are sticking around and reading what I'm writing. It makes me feel pretty good seeing the comments and the views go up and up every week. This has been Guard Bro, and I will see y'all next time.